Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Did you know that Ben Franklin's World now has its own Amazon Alexa skill? Alexa, enable Ben Franklin's World.
Okay, here's Ben Franklin's World. Welcome.
This means you can now listen to Ben Franklin's World on your Amazon smart speaker and tell it to do things like play your favorite episode. Alexa, tell Ben Franklin's World to play episode 130.
Here's 130 Paul Revere's Ride Through History, Doing History Rev.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. You can tell it to rewind to your favorite part. Alexa, tell Ben Franklin's World to rewind 10 minutes.
Skipping backward 10 minutes.
From the public memory so much that it's kind of a self-perpetuating.
Or you can tell it to stop playing the podcast so you can go do something else and then have it resume right where you left off when you're ready to listen again. Alexa, stop.
Okay, come back anytime to listen to your podcast. You just have to say, Alexa, resume.
So if you have an Amazon smart speaker, just tell it, Alexa, enable Ben Franklin's World. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 183 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. During the course of his lifetime, George Washington played three very important public roles. First, he served as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and helped the United States secure its independence from Great Britain. After independence, Washington served as the president of the Constitutional Convention, which, as we discovered in our conversation with Edward Larson in episode 61, was a very important role in early United States history. As Ed noted in episode 61, Washington's presence and leadership of that convention gave it legitimacy, and it played a role in encouraging many Americans to ratify the Constitution of 1787. And then, under the newly ratified Constitution, Washington served as the first president of the United States. In that position, he set important precedents for many of the presidents who have followed him, including presidents who have served during our own time. But one role we may not recognize George Washington as having played is a role that was personally very important to him. And that was his role as farmer and agricultural innovator. Douglas Bradburn, the CEO and president of George Washington's Mount Vernon, joins us so that we can explore the history of George Washington's storied estate and his life as a farmer. Plus, Doug's also going to help us discover more about Mount Vernon as a historic site, so we know all it has to offer us when we visit. Now, as we explore Mount Vernon and the life of George Washington farmer, Doug reveals how the Washington family acquired Mount Vernon and developed it as an agricultural estate and plantation, George Washington's work to build Mount Vernon into a model of sustainable agricultural practices, and the remarkable story of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and how and why it saved and continues to maintain George Washington's estate for future generations. All right, I think it's time for us to venture to the banks of the Potomac River so we can meet Doug and discover more about the private world of George Washington.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Prior to becoming president and CEO of Mount Vernon, he served as the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. Plus, he's published numerous articles in a book, The Citizenship of Revolution, Politics and the Creation of the American Union, 1774 to 1804. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Douglas Bradburn.
I'm delighted to be back, Liz. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I really should have said welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Doug, because we spoke with you in episode 33 about George Washington's library and reading habits.
That's right. Washington, of course, was always known as the man of action in the Revolutionary era and surrounded by brilliant other founders, but not often understood as a man who was a great reader himself and self-educated. And so it was good to explore that part of his profile.
So now you're the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. First, congratulations on your new position. And I wonder if you would tell us a bit about your new position and how you came to it.
Well, thank you. It's an extraordinary position because I get to be at the head of a great staff of people who manage and maintain George Washington's estate, make it available for 1.1 million visitors a year, including 350,000 school kids, and try to tell stories about the founding era and George Washington's relevance all over the world. So I feel like it's an extraordinary perch for a historian to be sitting on as we try to think about the purpose of history and trying to keep civic education relevant and trying to create a sustainable institution here. Mount Vernon has been around in this form since 1860, really, and I'm only the 11th president and CEO. They used to be called things like the resident superintendent, then they were called the director, and nowadays we're called the president and CEO. But it's all the same thing. I live on the estate with my family, so I live a few hundred yards away from George Washington's mansion house, right on the Potomac River. It's an extraordinary honor, and I feel a great sense of duty and history, and I'm delighted to be in this role.
And we're really delighted that you could rejoin us because we have a lot of questions about Mount Vernon as an estate and about George Washington as a farmer and businessman. And, well, Doug, you're really the perfect person to answer them for us. So why don't we begin with George Washington's estate? Would you tell us about the early history of Mount Vernon as the Washington's family homestead?
Sure. So that history, and I'll try to be brief and concise, it goes back to George Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, and his friend Nicholas Spencer, who received a 5,000-acre grant of land between Dogue and Little Hunting Creeks in what is considered to be part of the northern neck of Virginia, the proprietor of which was Thomas Lord Culpeper at the time. And this was given under a dispensation of his patron, King Charles II. So we're talking about 17th century Virginia history here. This land was originally given to George Washington's great-grandfather. By 1690, that 5,000-acre property was equally divided between George Washington's grandfather, a man named Lawrence Washington, and the heirs of Nicholas Spencer. Lawrence Washington left his land to his daughter Mildred, which is a great Washington family name, Mildred. And then in 1726, George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, purchased Little Hunting Creek Plantation from his sister Mildred and her husband at the time, Roger Gregory. Okay, are you still with me? So George Washington's father gets control of the land around here on the Potomac. It's called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. Augustine Washington moved his family to Little Hunting Creek Plantation between 1735 and 1739. So that means George Washington is a 3-year-old boy at the time. He eventually actually moves away from here, away from the Potomac, down to a place called Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, and that's really where George Washington grows up. But it's believed that the core of what we call the mansion house, so the famous house of Mount Vernon with the cupola and the piazza, the core of it was originally built in that period in 1737 or so by George Washington's father. And right now we're still learning more about that very early history of the house itself. But it would have been a somewhat grander than typical Chesapeake planter's house at the time, but very, very different from what you would see today. So then Augustine Washington gave his Little Hunting Creek Plantation to his oldest son, another Lawrence. So this is George's stepbrother, Lawrence Washington, who was about, I don't know, maybe 17 years older than George Washington or something like that. And his will made provision for George Washington to inherit the estate if Lawrence did not leave any heirs. In 1743, Augustine Washington dies, so George Washington's father dies when he's 11 years old. His stepbrother Lawrence lives at the Little Hunting Creek Plantation with his wife, Anne Fairfax. Fairfax is a very important name in Virginia. He renames the property at that time to Mount Vernon. This is Lawrence Washington, renaming the property Mount Vernon after his former commander, Admiral Edward Vernon of the British Navy, because we know that Lawrence Washington, as a captain, went down to the assault on Cartagena during the English War of Jenkins' Ear, and he named the estate after Admiral Vernon. So Lawrence Washington dies of tuberculosis in 1752, and he left Mount Vernon to his daughter, Sarah, who dies in 1754. And his widow, Anne Fairfax Washington, married a man named George Lee, another big Virginia name. Now, with Sarah dying at 1754, George Washington begins renting Mount Vernon from his former sister-in-law, because he will become the heir of the estate. And then Anne Fairfax dies in 1761, and George Washington fully inherits Mount Vernon. So he started living here in 1754 and then took it over fully in 1761. That estate was about 2,000 to 3,000 acres, and over the course of his life, he expands it to be 8,000 acres up and down the Potomac River. That estate expansion was made possible because of his marriage to Martha Dandridge Custis, who became Martha Washington, and she brought in a lot of wealth and enslaved individuals into his property, and they were able to expand the plantation at that time in the early 1760s when they first got married.
Okay, so we're talking about a really big historic estate. Now, while we're on the subject of the estate, Leslie is really curious about the physical grounds of Mount Vernon and how they've changed over time. So, Doug, how is Mount Vernon structured as a farm?
Well, that's a great question. So by the end of his life, he had about 8,000 acres, out of which 3,200 acres were under cultivation at different times. And what he did is he divided his estate into 5 different farms by his final kind of iteration of this. He, in the 1760s, as he's acquiring land on what we call the Peninsula Neck here, Mount Vernon Neck, he's acquiring land and consolidating land across the Potomac. And at that time, he's kind of dividing it into quarters and different farms, as a typical of a large planter in the Chesapeake would do. His were contiguous, and he was trying to create contiguous quarters, and he was very successful in buying land from other people who lived around him and then developing it. So he always had these kind of different regions and farms. By the end, he had 5 different farms. So one was called Dogue Creek, one was called Muddy Hole Farm, one was called Union Farm, one was called River Farm, and the one we think of as Mount Vernon today was the Mansion House Farm. So the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union today owns and operates about 400 acres plus the original Mansion House on what would have been his Mansion House Farm. That would have been the most picturesque farm, and it would have been the area where most of the cultivation was done for the support of visitors to the Mansion House. The other outlying farms had different functions within his sort of agricultural economy. So the Dogue Creek farm, for instance, had a grist mill on it and ultimately would have a distillery on it as he expanded in that direction. There's another one called River Farm, which is his major wheat farm. Washington, very early on in the 1760s, was one of these large farmers who went from being a tobacco planter to being a real farmer. He stopped the cultivation of tobacco on his largest portions of his estate because he didn't believe he could make any money on it, and he didn't like the way the British mercantile system operated. And he went to wheat cultivation, which is something that he saw was more sustainable. And he was getting very much involved in the latest ideas of English agriculture with rotating crops and husbandry, the role of animals. And these are things that weren't really done in the Chesapeake plantation-style farming, which was very destructive of the soil. So that was corn cultivation and also tobacco. And basically, once the fields were used up, they would just cut down more woods and move because there was plenty of land. But in his case, he was trying to build an estate that was going to be a model that would be sustainable. And this particularly becomes his passion after the American Revolution. So in the 1780s, that's when we see him really getting involved in the latest agricultural trends. By this point, he's traveled all over what is the United States during the war, meeting with all sorts of different American farmers and foreign farmers. And, in Pennsylvania, he's very impressed with what they do. In New England, he sees different styles. He's reading constantly about the latest techniques. So he brings that back to Mount Vernon, both the idea of the picturesque and the design of the landscape, but also the utility of the land and how to best use it. So his estate is really a dynamic entrepreneurial space for him. At the end of the Revolution, he's so famous, and he sees himself as sort of having retired from public life when he gives up his commission. He sees this role of helping Americans learn from the new style of agriculture is something that he can contribute to the new nation, that agriculture is so crucial to its future success that he can kind of show the way. And he has a somewhat elitist, old-fashioned model of the way that will happen. In American history, we think of the great agricultural reform movements of the 19th century. Those are really driven in some ways by that kind of spirit of democratic, expansion with these voluntary associations that people are joining that are helping to teach people about agriculture. And there's also a market-driven aspect to it. Washington's a gentleman of the 18th century, and he really thinks that, like a lot of the English reformers in the 18th century, that it's the role of great men in counties who have the means and have the capability to show the way, to create an example that can be emulated by other folks. So in some ways, his great experiments in agriculture don't have a huge impact down the road because this is simply not the way America is going to develop, learning from the example of great gentry. But on the other hand, he does do some extraordinary things that are really a generation ahead of what you're going to see, particularly throughout the South. But also, there are some lasting legacies that come out of his efforts in agricultural reform, including the introduction of the American mule, which is going to be such an important way that farmers throughout the South and Southwest can cultivate their lands. He gets very involved in breeding these giant jackasses he receives from the King of Spain and from Lafayette, these Maltese jackasses. He breeds them with horses and finds that the mules are much better for agricultural work because they're more tractable, they eat less, they're harder to kill. And so by the end of his time at Mount Vernon, very different from if you would have visited Mount Vernon in 1760 versus 1799. In 1760, a lot of the work would have been done by horses and occasional oxen. By 1799, most of the animal labor is being done by mules. So it's a really important transition there. So I went a little beyond your question, Liz, but it speaks to the nature of the way this plantation changed over time, both the look of it, what the land was producing, what the animals would have been doing and looked like on it as well.
What about the buildings on the estate? Buildings are really important to farming, and you mentioned that Washington had a rum distillery and a grist mill on his estate. So what were the other outbuildings that contributed to the operation and sustainability of Washington's farm and plantation?
That's a great question. Yes. So building buildings was a key to his vision for the future of farming as well. A lot of the buildings in the Chesapeake were put up very hastily, little corn sheds and things that weren't intended to last. He was interested in building things that lasted and designing things that could be particularly useful. So for instance, on River Farm, he put in a massive brick barn as well as outbuildings and housing for the enslaved individuals as well as for animals. But also he would arrange them in sort of a symmetrical fashion with a long vista, farm road that would be capped off by this complex of buildings so that it looked more like an orderly village and rather than just a haphazard plantation. Similarly, here at the Mansion House Farm, the beauty of Mount Vernon today is both a historic site and a learning site is that the Ladies Association retained as many of the outbuildings as they could. So we have the original kitchen, we have original greenhouse slave quarters, we have original buildings and, the dairy and the stables and, the dung repository has been reestablished. This complex of buildings really helps you understand, the way that the plantation operated. There's more 18th century buildings lasting on this estate than certainly any in the United States and possibly, throughout the hemisphere in terms of an agricultural complex that's all together. One of the most striking buildings that he designed is called the 16-sided barn, and we have a recreation of that. We have a kind of a little farm that helps show 18th century agriculture, but the barn itself disappeared in the 19th century. But it was a massive structure that George Washington designed while he was president, living in Philadelphia, and he wrote a great description to his steward to start building this thing, collecting materials for it. And it's based on double octagon shape. And what it allows is a treading barn so that you can tread your wheat indoors with horses running in a circle and all the, separating the chaff from the seed that would all fall through into the second floor. And it's a much more efficient way to do it. Similarly, in his grist mill, he installs a system for grinding grains. It's based on the third patent of the United States that he signed as president. It's the Oliver Evans system. And what it is it allows you to grind two different types of grains at once. So fine flour on one hand, but also coarse corn on the other. The corn would be used for plantation food and other needs, and the flour would be sold overseas, all powered by water, of course, with a mechanism that's 3 stories tall with elevators and hopper boys and, taking the human labor out of the process as much as possible. Very much what you see, why mills are the heart of the American Industrial Revolution, getting these mills to function in that manner. And Washington's very interested in trying to do those sorts of things. So ornamental buildings, but also buildings that work to be as efficient as possible to wring resources out of the soil.
Buildings were really important to farms in their operation, but so were people. And after we take a moment to talk about our sponsor, we should explore the people who lived and worked at Mount Vernon. It's hard to believe, but Ben Franklin's World is now in its 4th year of production. In fact, we've spoken with over 200 historians and now have more than 180 episodes. Now, one of the best parts of producing this podcast week after week is getting to hear from you. Every week, listeners like yourself email me, post comments and ideas on the Ben Franklin's World Facebook page or in our listener community, or they tweet me at Liz Covart. But there are thousands of you I haven't heard from yet, and everyone's voice matters. That's why the Omohundro Institute and I have put together a survey. We want to get to know you and hear what you think about the show. After all, Ben Franklin's World exists for you. The OI and I want you to enjoy discovering more about our early American past each and every week. And doing that in the most enjoyable, effective, and sustainable way possible is our number one priority. That's why I'm asking you for a big favor. Can you spare me just a few minutes to complete our online survey? We tested it in the office, and it really doesn't take more than just a few minutes to complete. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/survey and share your thoughts with us. I know we're all busy and that taking the time to do this survey is a really big favor. Please know that your participation will really help keep the show fresh and available for download every Tuesday. Plus, everyone who completes the survey will be entered into a drawing for a signed copy of some really great books about early American history. Again, our survey is available at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Thanks again for your help with this. I really look forward to hearing from you. Doug, Dalen would like to know more about Mount Vernon as a working plantation. Specifically, he'd like to know more about the enslaved people Washington had working and living on his farms and estate. So, would you tell us more about the enslaved population who once lived and worked at Mount Vernon?
Yeah, absolutely. Slavery, of course, was something that Washington used throughout his life. He inherited his first enslaved men and women when he was 11 years old when his father died. Slavery was the way things were done in the Chesapeake and, of course, as you know, unfortunately, throughout much of the Atlantic world. Now, Washington's case, by the end of his life, we'll start there and sort of work back, because that's when we have the best data on who was here at that time. Because, of course, when he dies, we have this great slave census that he produced in the process of trying to figure out who he owned and then figure out if he could free the ones he owned and also what to do with the ones that Martha were part of her dowry. But anyway, by 1799, there were 317 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Of that number, 42% were either too old or too young to work. So you have whole generations of enslaved people here. That's a very large number of enslaved people to live on one piece of property in the 18th century Virginia. You don't typically have those kinds of large numbers of enslaved people living together in the Chesapeake. You know, we think of the massive plantations of enslaved people. That's sort of a phenomenon of the antebellum years in the South with the massive cotton plantations in the Deep South. Anyway, so Washington confided to a nephew in that year, in 1799, that he had twice as many workers as he needed and that he felt trapped because he didn't want to sell the people because it was against his principles by that point in his life. And he didn't want to rent them out to others because it was impossible to do that without breaking up families. Now, of the 184 enslaved workers in 1799, about one quarter were domestics or skilled craftsmen. These are the ones who could work. One quarter were domestics or skilled craftsmen. So they either worked in the mansion house or around the mansion house farm. Most of these people were male and lived at the mansion house farm. One thing about transitioning to complicated agriculture with wheat farming, for instance, and husbandry is that the enslaved people have to learn a lot more skills, and also with the building. So his enslaved force was much more skilled than a typical Chesapeake force as well, because dealing with plows and with animals is very different than hoeing tobacco, and the different skill levels to maintain fences and ditching and across the estate, the carting. So he had a very diverse labor force, more than typical. 3/4 of the enslaved labor force was comprised of field laborers, and most of the field laborers, 61.4%, were women. That's sort of the enslaved labor force. There also was a force of about 30 white individuals living at Mount Vernon on this whole estate that included members of a family, hired farm managers, secretaries, craftsmen, particularly some of his craftsmen working in the distillery, as well as their families, some gardeners living on the plantation among the 317 enslaved Africans and African Americans. I can't recite to you the exact way the population changed over time, but essentially, when Washington began expanding Mount Vernon in the 1760s, he began expanding the enslaved labor force as well. He's really becoming a planter. He had imagined that he might be able to make a career as a military man in the 1750s. He's involved in the French and Indian War. He doesn't get this commission in the British Army. He has a really bittersweet experience in the French and Indian War. And it ends basically with the marriage to Martha, marrying Martha Dandridge Custis. She's the wealthiest woman in Virginia. She chooses George Washington, this famous war hero. They're both 26 years old. And by marrying her and moving full-time to Mount Vernon, he's bringing her wealth and her enslaved individuals to the estate to expand it, to make it into a large-scale tobacco plantation is what he has in mind. And it ultimately becomes a different kind of farm. But that's the kind of period of expansion in the early 1760s. After that, he doesn't really buy enslaved individuals. The population grows naturally, and the war happens, of course, so he's really not here. And then in the 1780s, he already is getting squeamish about the institution of slavery as a long-term solution for the problem of American agriculture, as well as his own plantation. And so at that point, it isn't purchasing anyone and he isn't selling anyone. And so he's trying to manage the population as best he can.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And it seems like we can visit the mansion house and all the valuable buildings on the estate and see how Washington's farm operated today because of this association. So what is the story of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and how and why did it acquire Mount Vernon?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. It's a great story. It really is an amazing American story of philanthropy and really the birth of American historical preservation. So in the 1850s, the last Washington family owners of Mount Vernon, John Augustine Washington III, who was George Washington's great-great-nephew, maybe great-great-great-nephew, they couldn't maintain the estate, really. It was too large and it wasn't productive enough. And there were people coming here all the time. Of course, he and Martha Washington are buried here, so it had already been a pilgrimage site, and they couldn't deal with all the people. And the house was falling apart. They offered it to the state of Virginia. They offered it to the United States government. At the time, of course, there's no model for a national park or anything like that. We're still 50 years away from that. Neither of the governments wanted to purchase the estate. And so it was a group of women. Anne Pamela Cunningham was the first regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, whose mother had encouraged her to think about trying to save the mansion, the estate of George Washington. And she did. She argued that, well, if the men of America won't save the house of the father of the country, then the women shall. And so she created this extraordinary group of all ladies, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, from all different states, north and south, hence the name of the Union. And at some level, she believed that this process could help, bring together some sectional healing as well. Washington is the father of this country, which in the 1850s is on the verge of tearing itself apart. And this national campaign they went on to get people to raise money to help support their purchasing is really extraordinary. I mean, they did it by selling roses. They did it with nickels and dimes. They did it all over the country. They also did it by sponsoring speeches. They had a lot of support from famous people like Edward Everett, who was a great orator at the time, who helped raise money to help purchase the estate. And so they raised ultimately $200,000 to purchase the estate and to make it available for people all over the country. And they saw their mission as a public mission, even though they are a private organization, and we still do. So the mission is to preserve the estate at the highest standards possible and to educate people all over the world about the life and legacy of George Washington so that future generations can be informed and inspired by his example. So it's an incredible model. So the Ladies Association really invented historic preservation, and they did it in the United States. It's quite different from many other countries because preservation is really coming out of this ideal of civic meaning. These are special places that have meaning to Americans as a nation. Who are we as a people? These places are preserved and protected, like a battlefield or like a house or a monument is built to represent things that speak to our civic culture, our civic religion of this experiment in democracy, right? Whereas in Europe, sometimes, preservation really comes out of the idea that something is a particularly beautiful piece of architecture or a great piece of art, and often coming down in a more aristocratic vein as something that a patron protects as a legacy of their family's greatness over time. And so this civic model is somewhat quite different. The Ladies Association is copied by a lot of different organizations in the 19th century, women's organizations that will take it upon themselves to preserve antiquities and houses. You see this with, in some respects, the DAR, the Society of Colonial Dames, the Virginia Preservation Societies, and many others as well. And so the Ladies Association is an important part of our story. The organization today continues those traditions. We've not only preserved the estate and the mansion and try to teach people all over the world, but we also preserve the viewshed across the river. So we work with conservationists in Maryland, and there's a national park that was created out of the efforts of one of the ladies in the 1950s that exists just to preserve the view. We spearheaded the innovation in conservation easements that people get attached to private property that restricts how big they can build their buildings, how tall they can grow their trees, they can't cut down their trees, that sort of thing, to help in this preservation of the view. So they've really been innovative throughout the years and taking on the challenges of the modern era. I think you had another aspect to that question about all the different buildings on the estate. Well, when the ladies first took over the mansion, of course, the mansion and the tomb of George Washington in some ways was the most important thing. The mansion, which is now iconic, was crucial as well. But they had a lot of recommendations from some of their expertise that they reached out to, some male architects who thought that they should just bulldoze everything around the mansion, all the outbuildings, all those historic buildings, which thank goodness they didn't, because now we are able to tell the story of the enslaved, which is something nobody really wanted to tell that story in the 19th century, partially because there were former enslaved people working at Mount Vernon as guides, and they could talk about it if people asked. And it was still, in that world, people still lived in a generation where they could remember slavery. But of course, later on, there's also the white institutions are not particularly interested in talking about enslaved individuals. But the Ladies Association always protected those structures and those outbuildings and the slave cemetery. Once the picket fence around that kind of disappeared, they put in a monument in the 1920s for the enslaved people, and have continued to try to tell that story. It's always not been the first priority of the institution. But because the early ladies were so strong in the efforts to preserve what Washington had, no matter what, we now can go back and really reestablish stories of those long-lost individuals as well. So they've really done an extraordinary job stewarding this property so that it can remain relevant to future generations.
You keep talking about all the stories that we can tell about Mount Vernon because of all the buildings, the museum, and the mansion house on the grounds. And Alec wonders how the presentation of Mount Vernon as an estate, as George Washington's home, has changed over time.
Well, that's a great question. And really, the answer to it is a study in the evolution of professional ideas about historic sites and historic site preservation. So at the very beginning, they just struggled in the first generation to make sure the place didn't fall down. So you got a bunch of wooden structures in Virginia that were built in the middle of the 18th century, some of which is old as the 1730s. And so how do you make sure that these things just don't turn to dust? They're not brick, they're not stone, they're wood. And so that's the kind of early effort, is really about survival, until they can get their financial footing in much better shape. And they weather that, and then the Ladies Association begins decorating the mansion. And so, in fact, the early members of the board, so the board is made up of all women, one per state, but not one from every state. They're called the vice regents. When the vice regents would come to visit Mount Vernon, they would stay in the mansion itself. I mean, there was nowhere really else to stay. They would stay in the mansion, and each vice regent would adopt a room. So I don't know them off the top of my head, but, say the vice regent from California might get what we call the new room, what used to be called the big dining room. And then they would decorate it with sort of oldie-looking objects, some of which were original Washington materials that, we were trying to get to come back to the house from family members. They've been dispersed all over the country. Some of them were just sort of like, say a Boston 18th century chair that had no particular reason to be at Mount Vernon, but it was an 18th century chair, and there it is. So that effort to sort of make it look and feel without really knowing what it looked and feel like, without really having the research ability to get at it. And so really over the course of time, the Ladies Association, as the historical profession has professionalized, as archaeology, anthropology, historical architecture, curatorial, of all these things professionalized over the 19th and 20th centuries, you get better and better at understanding what's appropriate for an 18th century Virginia plantation versus just some old house, what's actually antique versus what's just some old thing that your grandmother owned. how do you understand how they decorated houses in the 18th century? And as you understand more of that, you do get to understand better the labor practices. Like, what was it like to have people who were enslaved living and working and serving dinners in this particular space? And where did they cook? And how did that work? And so all these questions that you have to answer allow you to see more and more ways to understand how the space functioned. So by the middle of the 20th century, the Ladies Association had a big push running up to the bicentennial of Washington's birth. So in 1932, huge, big deal. This is when you get the George Washington Bridge and you get the George Washington Memorial Parkway leading to Mount Vernon. And there's a strong effort there to try to understand what the house actually looked like. That's when some of these iconic things actually come off the house. There'd been a balustrade across the roof that you still might see in old photos and postcards, which came off because they realized that was put on during Bushrod Washington's time, one of George Washington's heirs, that sort of thing. So architecturally trying to understand what was the house that Washington had when he died and restoring that as best as possible. So that's an ongoing understanding of studying the house over time and studying more and more records. The Ladies Association also was sort of spearheading the effort to edit George Washington's letters in a professional manner. First with this Fitzgerald volume of George Washington's writings, which they produced really in a timely manner to come out in the 1920s. But then later, of course, with the sponsorship of the George Washington's Papers Project in partnership with the University of Virginia, where not only are George Washington's writings, that is to say the letters he wrote on his diaries, but also all the letters he received are professionally transcribed and annotated. So as you know, as a historian, the more you have these resources available, the more you can do research and understand the past and interpret it in different ways. Not only George Washington and his life, but the women in his life, the enslaved people in his life. These are stories that can come out of these extraordinary research projects. So, with the changes in the 1970s towards social history and trying to tell the story of the common person and the everyday, you get more and more efforts to tell the stories of the enslaved people and not just, mention they were here, but really try to understand, how it functioned, how it changed over time, how many were here, what their lives were like. In addition to George Washington's material culture, what he was purchasing and from whom, and how did his economic story work. And so over time, you get that broader and broader effort to really understand the place, less as just a shrine to George Washington and more as a historical representation of the 18th century. And also, the tomb is there as well to commemorate the memory of Washington in a little more, spiritually cosmic way, I guess. And then finally, the latest trends of the Ladies Association was really a decision in the last 10 or 15 years to interpret the whole landscape in a way that's holistic. So the whole landscape becomes the historical artifact, not just a particular building or a number of buildings, but rather the landscape itself, the design, the woods, the gardens, the experience of the laborers here, the animals. So we've greatly increased our animal activity on the estate, the food. Yeah, so this whole place preservation is part of the movement here that we helped create, and it's a great model for it, precisely because we control 400 acres of that original estate. So we have the water and we have farms. We now own a grist mill and distillery and the estate. So really the whole place can be represented and protected with the finest professional research being done in multiple fields, archaeology, curatorial, architecture, history, and of course that can be used by our great educators in the latest pedagogical styles to try to reach all sorts of people in exciting new ways. So it's been a dynamic, transformational place over time, and it really has sometimes set the lead, sometimes it's followed in some of these disciplines, but that's where we see ourselves really as an effort to really be leaders in public history, leaders in historic site preservation and conservation, and leaders in education.
As we've been discussing throughout our entire conversation, when we go to visit Mount Vernon today, we're not just going to find George Washington's mansion house. We're going to go there and see outbuildings, a grist mill, a rum distillery, gardens, and even animals, just like George Washington had on his farm. And we're also going to find a presidential library and a museum. Now, Doug, you told us all about the George Washington Library the last time we spoke in episode 33. So I wonder if you would now tell us about the Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center at Mount Vernon. And Danny is particularly curious about its present Lives Bound Together exhibit.
The Donald W. Reynolds Museum and Education Center opened in 2006. It initially began as an idea in the 1990s. So if you came to Mount Vernon in 1990, which might have been around the first time I came to it, now that I think about it. I came when I was at college at the University of Virginia on a trip. And the estate would have been, the mansion house and the outbuildings, but there really wasn't a museum anywhere. They didn't have the model farm with the 16-sided barn. I think they'd just taken over the grist mill at that time. And the effort of the Ladies Association really beginning in the 90s was to do more with education, to do not just preservation and letting people explore and see the place, but really educate people more aggressively about the life and legacy of George Washington and everything that went on here. And so the idea was to build a visitor center. And let's have a visitor center that can help do some of that work. And that grew and grew and grew in ambition and scale until it became this museum and education center. The Ladies Association raised $110 million to build the Donald Reynolds Museum and Education Center, along with another big building that we call the Orientation Center, which has movies in it. And when you visit Mount Vernon, it's the first place you'll walk into. It's where you buy your tickets and, where you get oriented to the estate. The Museum and Education Center really is comprised of two different functional spaces. One is, we'll call it the museum. And the museum is sort of a more traditional museum spaces where you have objects and chairs and you have, the porcelain and you've got the farm implements. You've got the great stuff that, Mount Vernon, George Washington and Martha Washington owned. And it's more set up along the lines of, like an art museum or a decorative arts museum, more accurately, where the stuff is there and it's presented and interpreted. And the other side of the space, as we call the Education Center, was designed to be more of a biographical exhibit on George Washington's life, which includes interactive technologies, and then we have a 4D theater in there where it snows on you. We've got, or we might say, a modern museum experience, particularly for school groups, for children. I think the audience they were shooting for was kind of like sophisticated high schoolers, but, something that could engage their minds, but also keep them interested and active. So we have these two kinds of spaces in the museum and education center. You noted there was a question Danny was asking about Lives Bound Together exhibit. Now, in the museum, when that was originally designed in 2006, there was an idea of a permanent exhibit in the museum, which would be things like, a dining room set of the Washingtons, different farm implements, the original, cupola in there, all sorts of original objects and chairs and documents that could circulate through there. But then also a changing exhibit, a temporary exhibit space. And the first one I think they did when they opened the museum was a temporary exhibit on George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, so a celebration of Lafayette. Now, the Ladies Association wanted to do a major exhibit in our changing space on slavery, Lives Bound Together, which is a story of the enslaved people here at Mount Vernon with a particular focus on the whole story of all of them, as many as we can tell, but also particular biographies of about 17 individuals, enslaved individuals, children, men, women, throughout the time of Mount Vernon's existence under the Washington. But then also a story of the legacy of the enslaved, both the ones that Washington freed in his will and also the ones that remained enslaved because they were owned by the Custis estate and therefore went to the Custis heirs, ultimately breaking up families at Mount Vernon once the Washingtons died. Anyway, that exhibit has been an award-winning exhibit. It's been extraordinary. It cost about $1 million to put together. The research in it is phenomenal and cutting edge. Because George Washington was so famous, because so many people, kept to make sure his letters didn't disappear, we can tell these stories in his own papers of men and women who didn't have the benefit of any education, of course. They were enslaved. They didn't have baptismal records or marriage records. But all these lives can be reproduced to a certain extent through the research that we've been able to do through the Papers Project. So the Lives Bound Together exhibit was too big for our exhibit space, that part of the museum, which was the changing space. And so we decided to take over the whole museum with the Lives Bound Together exhibit. And it really is extraordinary. And I encourage people to come see it and also explore it online a little bit. We have a great database in there that allows you to research in the lives of the enslaved people themselves, which still needs a lot of work, but is an ongoing commitment and project for us, as is our archaeology and many of the other ways that we learn about people who lived here. That exhibit will remain in place until the fall of 2019. It was always intended that it would be a temporary exhibit as part of our temporary exhibit space. But the great thing, I think, is that a lot of the research has been so impactful that we'll be able to take those aspects that went into the exhibit and really scatter them throughout the estate. So we have a reproduced slave house down in our model farm, but also we have the reconstructed slave quarters around the greenhouse and also a little museum in there to the enslaved. We have all sorts of tours now about the enslaved, which are much better informed because of the research that went into the exhibit. We have ongoing work being done, as I said, in archaeology to continue to enhance that story. And we have a great digital presence for all of these things as well. The museum itself will be reinstalling, some of the old exhibits, but we'll also be rethinking a little what we're doing in there. And my hope as well is that we'll be able to create some traveling panels from the Lives Bound Together exhibit that we can travel around the country to try to tell that story better.
You mentioned traveling around the country. And I think what's really neat and what may surprise a lot of us is that the impact and efforts of Mount Vernon and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has really grown beyond the physical estate of Mount Vernon. In fact, on occasion, Mount Vernon has been known to partner with other organizations, such as the home institution of this podcast, the Omohundro Institute, to get high-quality history and historical research out into the world. So, Doug, I wonder if you would tell us about Mount Vernon's work to bring history and historical research out into the world where it can be useful.
Mount Vernon Ladies Association, when they built the library, so the Presidential Library for George Washington, one of their major goals there was to really become a center for research. And they've very much invested in research. And I believe firmly that investing in research and new work is the way that you make an old institution dynamic and sustainable and relevant over the course of the next generation, because researchers are always asking questions about the present as well as the past. How did we get to look the way we look? And the library allows us to, because we invest in research, to have great fellowship programs and conferences, things here on the estate, but also to partner with other institutions to do that in other places. So with the Omohundro Institute, under the great leadership of Karen Wolf, as you know, one of the first conferences we had after the library opened was on slavery. And the Omohundro Institute has done extraordinary conferences on slavery going back to when they initially released the Transatlantic Slavery Database, I think in 1998. They had a conference in Ghana, they had conferences in Barbados and in Williamsburg, of course. But to choose Mount Vernon to do a major conference looking at region and nation, regional slavery's differences, in the post-Atlantic turn period, was a crucial moment. And we did it at the same time that we opened the new Lives Bound Together exhibit. So to mark that moment and also to kind of look at the state of the field. The library allows those kinds of academic partnerships, and some of them we're also involved with include the Georgian Papers Project, which, as you know, is the extraordinary project to explore and digitize the papers of George III's household and George II and George IV, which are in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. We were one of the early institutions involved in providing a fellowship to that in partnership with King's College London and also the Royal Collection Trust. We send a fellow every year who lives for 2 months in England and does research at Windsor. They do some teaching at King's. And then King's College London sends us a scholar who does research at Mount Vernon on 18th century subjects of interest, like the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution or agricultural reform or foodways or slavery, anything like that. So that's a great partnership. We also have, of course, other partnerships. So we have one with the Saul Price School at the University of Southern California, where we do leadership lectures. One of the things I think that history sites can help remain relevant in is this whole question of leadership, because leadership is an interesting concept that we shouldn't, as historians, allow it to be controlled by the business schools and the psychology departments and the political science departments, because leadership is one of the reasons why things change. I mean, historians study continuity and change. Not the only reason. There's lots of reasons why things change. But one of the reasons things do change is because sometimes leaders bring people together to make change. And it is a subject that historians should take some time to think about, but it's a way that we can make our subjects relevant to our ongoing generation today who want to learn about leadership and who think we're living through a crisis of leadership or want to figure out how they can turn young people into leaders. And so studying the failures and examples of the past, again, these stories that unite us and help inspire us, can be very helpful in a way to make a historic site relevant in a tangible way. Not to all people, but to some audiences, it's one route. And so we have a leadership program in the library, and that has really thrived with partnerships, including this ongoing lecture series. And finally, Our teacher programs, our success is built around partnering with other historic sites throughout the country. And there's way too many to list because we do bring 160 teachers from all over the country to Mount Vernon every year in groups of 20. They live on the estate and they get to learn about how to teach the themes of early American history and how to bring those into a contemporary classroom. But we also go around the country and help mobilize those teachers to do professional development in their own communities. So at least 5 times a year, you'll find us in different states. And we found that it's really only effective if we can work with other historic sites or museums that are already tapped into those communities. We can partner with them to help deliver some of our materials, always available for free for teachers, to try to help them do their job as best they can. I mean, as you know, history teachers and social studies teachers and civics teachers don't have the same professional development dollars that STEM teachers get right now. And so our institutions can really help empower those teachers, to give them an ability to feel like their work is valuable, to give them a way to keep learning, to keep honing their professional craft, to find a way to network and reach other teachers, because sometimes they're very isolated. And so I very much believe those are important programs that we do as well. So Mount Vernon gets out and about, and look for us sponsoring conferences overseas as well. That's something we won't do as much as, say, the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, but we will do it, and hopefully you will be at one of those soon.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. As you know, this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the Mount Vernon Ladies Association had not saved Mount Vernon in 1858? What would have happened to the estate, and how would our knowledge of George Washington, Mount Vernon, and of all the people who lived and worked on the estate be different?
Well, that's a fascinating counterfactual question. And, the more and more I've been here, the more impactful I understand this institution to have been in our history in a lot of different ways, more than I can cover. But if we start from the present, right now we got, an extraordinary community of people. We employ over 600 people in this community at Mount Vernon. We touch lives and work together. None of these people would be together and impacting their local communities in all these different ways. The Mansion House would have fallen apart. They wouldn't have persisted, I think. It would have been maybe adapted in strange ways and built upon. All the stories of the outbuildings would have disappeared. There would have been massive development around this area, as well as across the river here, where you would have had all sorts of eyesores and the regular rampant American development. Even a longer term, the inspiration of the Ladies Association to help other groups understand how they could preserve their important buildings and their important communities. The colonial dames alone, I think, control 11 or 8 different historic homes. There's no guarantee that those would have survived either if the Ladies Association hadn't come together. The Virginia Association of Antiquities, which has been so important in the preservation of Virginia history, wouldn't have existed probably without the model of the Ladies Association. So, when people do great things, they can inspire others to do wonderful things. And America has built up a very interesting voluntary civic groups of historic preservation, of which Mount Vernon is the font of a lot of that, in addition to being the leader in a lot of the techniques of preservation, which wouldn't exist in the forms they exist. And when you get to the bigger question of our knowledge of George Washington, I think it would be greatly diminished. The Ladies Association really showed the way when it came to preserving records and trying to annotate and publish the papers of George Washington in a professional manner with the Fitzgerald volumes from the turn of the 20th century. And that would go on, of course, to have such a big impact in all those great projects. But I think more generally, too, there's a huge loss to our civic culture when we lose these spaces that have meaning that can connect us together. You think about Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, right? And he's trying to get the country to see themselves as a whole. And he talks about the mystic chords of memory that unite us from every patriot grave to every battlefield. These mystic chords of memory out of which the Symphony of America can connect itself, that shows us who we are. If these historic sites don't exist, we lose those great chords of memory in that symphony. We have to have places that connect us to each other. Otherwise, it really does just become a mad scrabble for more stuff rather than, having a place like Mount Vernon that can help you reflect on, be inspired by the extraordinary life of this person, but also as a place of reconciliation to understand the limits of these individuals and the context through which the United States grew over time. Mount Vernon serves that purpose, and I think serves it well. So the 1 million people a year who come here, and the 1 million people who came before that, and the 90 million who have come to Mount Vernon since 1860, none of those people would have come here. And some of those people were quite famous and influential people. When FDR, when he's trying to convince Americans to support the British at the beginning of World War II, he brings Churchill to the tomb of George Washington, and they lay a wreath. These are meaningful moments. Woodrow Wilson spoke at Mount Vernon in 1918, 100 years ago this year, with a big speech about basically the League of Nations movement. Mount Vernon is a place that has always been a touchstone for thinking about, who we can be, how we can think big, and also how we all have that great challenge to be not a perfect union, but a more perfect union. Every generation has a role to play in perfecting what's been handed down to us. So I think if the Ladies Association hadn't saved the place, I think the American culture would be greatly weaker than it is, and it would be diminished by the lack of this extraordinary place.
Doug, before we conclude, does Mount Vernon have any special events or exhibitions coming up that we should know about?
Oh, my goodness. This is a great question. We do have a special exhibition that we've just launched called Be Washington. Now, this is in our education center. Remember, that's the space where we're doing the exciting biographical work of Washington and trying to engage younger people in particular. But this is an extraordinary interactive educational experience where you are put into the boots or into the shoes of George Washington. And you sit there in this room full of people and you watch a little mini 2-minute documentary, and it sets the stage. So one of the cases, for instance, is the Whiskey Rebellion. It's the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. These farmers have refused to pay their taxes. And you are General Washington. You're President Washington. You have to decide what to do. And it gives you different choices, 3 different choices that are authentic, real choices based on what Washington options were given to him. And then you have to listen to advisors. So you can click on a little button and you listen to different advisors who give you advice. So it might be, your Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, explaining why the excise law needs to be supported and what to do. Or it might be the governor of Pennsylvania, Mifflin, who's saying that we should just allow the Pennsylvania government to take it and all that sort of thing. But these are real advice, all based on a primary source that George Washington would have read or would have influenced him, as he has to, at the end of this, make a decision about what to do. So you make the decision of what you did. You then get to see what everybody else in the room decided to do. Then you get to see what George Washington decided to do, and then you can move along. So it's a really great new experience. But Liz, I think the thing that's wonderful about it is that it also can be played in classrooms around the country, online at bewashington.org. You can play this game. You can network your classroom together so that all the students can play the game together and the teacher can show the movies at the front of the screen. And then you can have a debate about why some people chose this and why they chose that. It's intended to teach the history, to teach a little bit about decision making, but also to allow people to recognize that we need to take multiple opinions before we make complicated decisions, that there's lots of different point of views about what to do and lots of different ideas about what's right sometimes in complicated situations. And it's worthwhile being a little more deliberative about what we do. So I'm very excited about this educational experience we've put together, and I would encourage everybody to come here and do it or check out bewashington.org for themselves.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I know we're going to have more questions about Mount Vernon and all its different programs. So how can we get in contact with you or someone on your staff?
If you have research questions, you should forward them to our library here. We have a tremendous staff over there whose job it is to answer research questions from people all over the world. And you can find those links on, again, mountvernon.org/library, or click through to the Washington Library and find those contact information. The website itself has got a lot of information, not only on Mount Vernon, but on George Washington Life and Times. Our George Washington Encyclopedia has grown to, I think we reached 10 million users of it since we launched in 2013 when the library opened. And that's been an extraordinary resource, widely used by teachers and students. And I encourage any graduate students who listen to this to reach out to our team at the library if they're interested in writing their own encyclopedia articles as well. We'd love to feature more and more essays on any particular topic related to Washington's world. And finally, if people want to reach me, my email address is available on our webpage as well. And so please feel free to send me a note and a link.
Douglas Bradburn, thank you so much for joining us again here on Ben Franklin's World and for taking us through the history of Mount Vernon. And all it has to offer us today is a museum and historic site.
Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate the opportunity.
In 1853, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association set to work fundraising so that it could purchase George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. It wanted to own the estate so that it could preserve and maintain the mansion house and make it available to public visitation. In 1858, the Ladies Association realized its goal when it purchased the estate for the price of $200,000, which is really an impressive amount of fundraising because today that $200,000 would be roughly equivalent to $6.1 million. Now, preserving, maintaining, and interpreting the history of the house and the Washington family proved to be a real challenge for the Ladies Association early on. Because, as Doug revealed, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association basically had to invent historic preservation practices to carry out its work. But its members embraced this challenge. They believed that preserving Mount Vernon was important because they saw many ways in which the house, tomb, and estate of George Washington spoke to American civic identity as citizens. Therefore, the Ladies Association experimented and developed preservation and interpretive practices, which they've gradually adjusted and adapted over time, so that now, in our own present day, we can visit George Washington's Mansion House farm and its 400 acres. Now, when we visit Mount Vernon, we will see evidence that Washington proved to be an entrepreneurial farmer. He sought to develop his estate into a sustainable business. So rather than deplete the fertility of his soil by planting tobacco, as most Virginia planters did, Washington cultivated wheat. He rotated crops, practiced husbandry, and added a gristmill and rum distillery to his estate so his farm could thrive on multiple streams of income. As Doug noted, Washington built a model farm, which made him seem like a farmer years ahead of his time. Of course, in terms of his practice of slavery, Washington was very much a man of his time. Washington directed the activities and development of his estate and plantation, while enslaved people performed the labor needed to implement his directives and actually make the estate sustainable. Now, thanks to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's investment in historical research and its commitment to support the Papers of George Washington editorial project, we know a fair bit about how Washington's farm operated and about many of the enslaved people who made its operation possible. And this is what I think has been the most fascinating part of our exploration. Our discovery of just how we've come to know what we know about Mount Vernon, its operation, and the lives of many of the people who once lived on the estate. It turns out that we know a lot about George Washington and Mount Vernon because of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and its commitment to investing in historical research and new work about Washington and his estate. In fact, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has a long history of raising money to support history and historical research. In recent years, it's raised $110 million to build a state-of-the-art museum and education center. It raised more than $106 million to build a presidential library. And it continually invests in fellowship programs, conferences, museum exhibits, teacher workshops, and other programs to get history out into the world. The association really views investment in history as a benefit to society, and as a way to keep their organization and its work dynamic and sustainable. Plus, it's also really neat to see just how far the reach of one historic site and one organization can have. I mean, the reach of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association extends a long distance away from the banks of the Potomac River, and the impact of the organization seems to have been really big. On a related note, the Omohundro Institute shares many of these same ideas and values. They continually invest in historical research and new work about early America, with its fellowship programs and publications, its support of the Georgian Papers program and its role as the program's primary U.S. partner, and in its partnerships with organizations like Mount Vernon and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the Omohundro Institute wants to get high-quality history out into the world where it can be useful and relevant in so many different areas of society. It's why they support the production of this podcast, and truth be told, why I agreed to produce Ben Franklin's World as an official Omohundro Institute publication. The OI's passionate commitment for this dynamic and important work of supporting the production of high-quality history and making it widely available so it can be used is something I really wanted to be a part of, and a mission I really wanted to help support and further. Okay, you'll find more information about Doug, Mount Vernon, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, plus notes for everything we talked about today, on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/183. If you teach history to kids, you should really check out the teacher workshops Doug mentioned. I had the great fortune to participate as a presenter at one of the George Washington Teacher Institute summer programs last year, and all I can say is, it was an amazing experience. It was a 5-day residential program that immersed us in the history of early America by using the Washingtons as a window onto how we can explore and interpret various aspects of the history. For example, the week I participated in was all about women in early America, so we used Martha Washington, Ona Judge, who you may remember from our conversation with Erica Dunbar in episode 137, and all these other women within and without the Washington family to explore how women lived and worked during the 18th and early 19th centuries and how we can get at the details of their lives through historical records. Plus, Mount Vernon and its staff treated us as VIP guests. They provided accommodations for us right on the estate and gave us the run of the grounds after hours. So yeah, I took advantage of that perk and watched the sunrise over the Potomac River while sitting on George Washington's porch. I've included a link to the George Washington Teacher Institute so that you can check out all their workshops and discover how you can attend one. Honestly, I'm really hoping they invite me back because it was a lot of fun and I learned a lot. If you haven't taken my listener survey yet, I hope you'll consider doing so. Your feedback on the show is really important because I want to hone my skills and create episodes that interest you. So please consider taking my survey. You can take it at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Finally, have you ever visited Mount Vernon or attended one of its non-Virginia-based events? I'd love to hear about your experience. So please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.